On a grey October morning in 1787, the HMAV Bounty slipped its moorings at Deptford and began her slow journey towards Spithead, where she would await final orders for a voyage that would become one of the most infamous maritime stories in history. Captain William Bligh, already fretting over the southern seasons, was eager to round Cape Horn before the treacherous summer ended. But delays came quickly. At first, bad weather hindered Bounty's arrival at Spithead until early November, and the Admiralty, not really seeing his mission as a priority given the rapidly deteriorating situation with France, hardly saw his mission as important. Sailing orders would then be delayed for nearly a month, and it was not until the 28th of November that the ship finally made a bid for the open sea, only to be trapped again by relentless contrary winds, unable to clear Spithead until the 23rd of December. But you may ask, what is this ship? Why are we here today? And why is it so important? Well, today we're going to go over the story of the mutiny on the Bounty, a tale that I always thought was incredibly ingrained in the minds of those of us who grew up in the Pacific, but the more and more I grew up I learnt that today largely a lot of people don't know about it. It's slowly being forgotten to the pages of history. Let's go back in time a little bit, to the bustling shipyards of Hull in Yorkshire, where a humble little collier named Bethia was launched in 1784 from the Blades Yard. She was an unremarkable vessel at first, 3-masted, 91 feet or 27 metres in length, 25 feet or 7.4 metres across her widest, and weighing only 230 tonnes. This ship was set to have life as a boring little training vessel, lugging cargo, before inevitably being worked to death, taken as a prize or foundering in a storm. But as with all great tales, fate would intervene. See, just a few years earlier, another one of these ignominious and easily forgettable cargo ships had set off under a Royal Navy lieutenant known as James Cook. On this voyage, the Endeavour would, under Cook, open up the world to the British in a way that had not been done since Columbus sailed to North America in 1492 for the Spanish. The voyage of James Cook in itself is one that I will eventually cover on this channel, or my co-host Rex will cover, but suffice it to say, the Endeavour collided with the Great Barrier Reef off the east coast of Australia. Her sturdy build, coupled with some quick action from the crew, saved the ship and the expedition from certain loss, from a kind of incident that would have destroyed a much larger, purpose-built warship. The Endeavour's voyage proved to the Navy just how useful these cargo ships were at voyages geared towards exploration, and in May 1787 the Royal Navy acquired Bethia for £1,950, a sum that would equate to about £300,000 today. She was rechristened as His Majesty's Armed Vessel Bounty, HMAV, rather than HMS for His Majesty's ship, although today she's more commonly referred to simply as HMS Bounty. The ship was armed with just 4 short 4-pounder carriage guns and 10 half-pounder swivel guns, enough to defend against only lightly armed pirates or native canoes intent on doing a bit of harm, but nothing to fight against a larger ship. The Bounty was then given her orders, and she was destined for a significant mission. Bounty's mission was born from both science and commerce. The Royal Society, under the direction of its president, the eminent Sir Joseph Banks, the man who had sailed with Cook aboard Endeavour, nearly dying from scurvy during the voyage, and many ways an inspiration for the character of Stephen Maturin, had conceived an ambitious expedition to collect breadfruit plants from the tropical island of Tahiti and transport them to the British colonies in the West Indies. The hope was that the fast-growing breadfruit tree could serve as an inexpensive food source for enslaved workers on Caribbean plantations. It was a simple idea, and Bounty would be the ultimate test. Under Banks' personal oversight, Bounty underwent a significant transformation at the Deptford dockyard along the Thames. A great cabin, traditionally the captain's private quarters, was converted into a floating greenhouse. Glazed windows and skylights allowed sunlight to reach the 1,000 breadfruit potted plants that would have been stowed there. A lead-covered deck and drainage system ensured that the precious fresh water would not be wasted in order to keep them alive on the voyage, but this did lead to a fair few issues. Namely, the scientific refit cut down the space allotted to the crew who were already pressed into a severely overcrowded small vessel. And because she wasn't a commissioned warship, there would be no marines aboard to maintain discipline. The ship therefore was in every sense of the word a gigantic powder keg, and to prevent it going off and exploding, a special captain would be needed, a captain that the Bounty did not get. With the full support and personal backing of Joseph Banks, The command of the breadfruit exhibition aboard Bounty was entrusted to Lieutenant William Bligh. Now, by all accounts, Bligh was a seasoned naval officer with a pedigree to match. He was born in 1754 in Plymouth to a family steeped in naval and military tradition, distantly related to Admiral Sir Richard Rodney Bligh. His career had begun with promise. At just 21, he had served as sailing master on HMS Resolution during James Cook's third and final voyage from 1776 to 1780. It was an appointment few young officers could dream of, and although Bligh took immense pride in the role, he would later express frustration that his contributions had been downplayed in the official records of the expedition. Or at least that's what Bligh would claim. See, Bligh is someone who would quite often think very highly of himself, and take every opportunity to make sure others were acutely aware of his own feelings surrounding the topic of William Bligh. Following the end of the American War of Independence in 1783, Bligh and many other naval officers found themselves ashore on half pay. This period in time was a little strange. It was in many ways a brief island of peace between two major conflicts. During the peace, the Royal Navy had been dramatically downsized. Bligh was placed on half pay, and for a time he turned to the merchant service, captaining the Britannia, a vessel owned by his wife's uncle, and doing this he earned a decent wage. More than he would as an officer in the Royal Navy, but there was no glory in it, no way for Bligh to achieve the respect and the fame that Cook achieved and that he so craved. So when the Admiralty offered him command of the Bounty in August 1787, Bligh accepted despite the financial sacrifice. The appointment was prestigious, even if it came with complications. The Bounty, rated as a cutter, was too small to carry the usual complement of warrant officers, so Bligh was expected to take on multiple roles, including that of purser, responsible for all the provisions and finances and accounts aboard the ship. That will be important later. And his orders were really ambitious. After departing England, Bligh was to sail the Bounty through the treacherous southern route around Cape Horn into the Pacific. Once in Tahiti, Bligh would collect the breadfruit plants and then steer westward through the Endeavour Strait, navigating between Australia and New Guinea. From there, the voyage would continue across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and onward to the British colonies in the West Indies. By the time she returned home, the Bounty would have completed a full circumnavigation of the globe, and that was an extraordinary undertaking for a vessel of her size. The kind of undertaking that Bligh would think would get him some laurels and maybe some riches for navigating the Bounty successfully through that voyage. Under Bligh, the HMAV Bounty had a complement numbering 46 men. 44 of these men were from the Royal Navy, including her captain, and 2 others were civilian botanists. Directly beneath Bligh in the chain of command were the warrant officers, appointed by the Navy Board, led by John Fryer, the ship's sailing master. Alongside Fryer were the boatsman, surgeon, carpenter, and gunner, each responsible for vital functions aboard the small vessel. Supporting this corps were 2 master's mates and 2 official midshipmen. These were joined by several young gentlemen or aspiring officers, many of them just teenagers. These young men signed aboard as able seamen but lived and trained alongside the midshipmen, enjoying privileges of junior officers. Though technically enlisted as common sailors, they were treated as part of the ship's command structure because it was expected in future that these would become the officers themselves that would be part of the future Royal Navy. Most of the crew had been hand-picked by Bligh or recommended to him through influential patrons. Among the familiar faces were gunner William Peckover and armourer Joseph Coleman, both of whom had sailed with Bligh during Cook's third voyage on Resolution. Others, like the carpenter and some able seamen, had more recently served with Bligh on the merchant ship Britannia. One of the more notable among the crew was the 23-year-old Fletcher Christian. Hailing from a wealthy Cumberland family with Manx roots, Christian had turned his back on a legal career in favour of life at sea. He had sailed with Bligh twice before and had proven himself a capable navigator. Their relationship had developed into a kind of mentorship, and although Christian initially volunteered to serve without pay as one of the young gentlemen, Bligh soon appointed him to a salaried post as a master's mate. Another young gentleman was the 15-year-old Peter Hayward, distantly related to Christian and also of Manx descent. After a year training aboard HMS Powerful, a docked vessel in Plymouth, Hayward secured his place in the Bounty through Bligh's father-in-law, who happened to be a family friend. The 2 civilian botanists had been personally selected by Sir Joseph Banks. David Nelson, the chief botanist, was a veteran of Cook's final voyage and already familiar with Tahiti and its language. His assistant, William Brown, was a former midshipman who had seen combat against the French. Banks also used his influence to arrange midshipman berths for 2 of his protégés, Thomas Hayward and John Hallett. Bligh's crew was by naval standards quite young, most of being under 30, and at 33 Bligh himself was still a relatively young commander. Some, like the experienced gunner Peckover, who had served on all 3 of Cook's voyages, and sailmaker Maurice Lebogue, were closer to 40, and the youngest aboard were Hayward and Hallett, both just 15 when the ship left England. On board, living arrangements were dictated by rank. Bligh, though he had surrendered the great cabin to make room for plant storage, maintained a private sleeping quarters and a small adjacent dining area on the starboard side. Fryer had a small cabin on the opposite side, and the other warrant officers and David Nelson had cramped cabins on the lower deck. The master's mates, midshipmen and young gentlemen shared a communal area in the rear of the ship called the cockpit, just behind the captain's dining area. As junior officers, they were permitted access to the quarterdeck though, which gave them a little bit more space. The rest of the crew, able seamen and lower ranked men, were housed in the forecastle, a dim, windowless space measuring 36 by 22 feet with a low ceiling of just under 5 feet 7 inches. It was tight, stifling, you couldn't breathe in there, and it contrasted very sharply with the privilege and space afforded to the officers. This was the state of the Bounty, and she set off in 1787, in the month of October. As the Bounty finally got underway, Bligh instilled a strict regime modelled after his time with Cook. Hygiene, diet and discipline were enforced, and the captain's obsession with cleanliness and the health of his crew bordered on fanatical. Early accounts of the voyage note that it proved effective, as Bligh reported cheerfulness and harmony among the men, with no punishments necessary. Only the ship's surgeon, Thomas Huggins, stood out as a failure, being described as lazy, slovenly, and often drunk. Among the officers, Bligh formed a close bond with young master's mate Fletcher Christian, so close in fact that Christian was promoted above his superior John Fryer to the acting rank of lieutenant by March 1788. This was where the cracks really began to show, because in what will shock absolutely nobody, Fryer's relationship with Bligh quickly soured. A week later, after Fryer's insistence, Bligh ordered the first flogging on the voyage to a sailor called Matthew Quintal for mutinous behaviour. The weather deteriorated as Bounty approached Cape Horn, and for over 2 weeks the men battled unyielding gales and icy seas, with Bligh pushing the ship and his men to their absolute limits. He was forced finally to admit defeat on the 17th of April, where he announced they would abandon the attempt to reroute via the Cape of Good Hope, giving up the attempted circumnavigation. The ship would anchor in False Bay on the 24th of May for repairs and reprovisioning, and while in port, Bligh would make the decision as purser to lend Fletcher Christian money. Keep this in mind, because it again will come back to haunt the captain. Crossing the Indian Ocean proved to be a long and tedious voyage, but still far easier than dealing with the Horn. They sighted Tasmania in August and dropped anchor in Adventure Bay. It was here that tensions truly flared for the first time, as the crew witnessed Bligh arguing with the carpenter over wood-cutting methods, before what can be described as an incredibly petty decision, cutting the sailors' rations simply to assert dominance and win the argument. The voyage then would continue onward to Tahiti, but the strain kept growing. Fryer and Bligh clashed again when the captain refused to certify Fryer's competence unless coerced. Then the drunken surgeon Huggin bled a seaman so carelessly that the man died of infection. Huggin lied, blaming scurvy, leading Bligh to apply anti-scorbutic treatments amongst the whole crew, though it was likely too late for the man. Huggin's drinking then worsened, so Bligh confiscated his alcohol, a decision that would again alienate another core member of the crew, even if he was a bit incompetent. Finally, on the 26th of October 1788, after nearly a year at sea and over 27,000 nautical miles, Bounty came to anchor at Mutiny Bay, Tahiti, where their arrival was greeted with warmth. The Tahitian chief Taina actually remembered Bligh from Cook's voyage years earlier, and the captain was welcomed with an exchange of gifts and complete support from the native islanders. Fletcher Christian would then be appointed to oversee the shore party, who began constructing a nursery compound. For the next 5 months, as the crew worked gathering breadfruit plants, discipline began to fly out the window. Duties were light, and the allure of Tahiti, its freedom, and above all for the young men, its women, overwhelmed many of the crew. 18 men, Fletcher Christian among them, contracted venereal diseases, while others formed long-term relationships with local women. Christian himself allegedly fell in love with a woman called Matua, who he affectionately renamed Isabella. Bligh, to his credit, would remain chaste, but being a sailor, he understood and tolerated the crew's indulgences. But as time went on and the crew got even more relaxed, Bligh's anger grew and grew. As discipline declined, punishments increased. Floggings became common, and Christian, once favoured, now found himself the target of Bligh's public rebukes and insults. On the 5th of January 1789, 3 men deserted, and Bligh, now paranoid, suspected a broader plot. It is possible that he publicly denounced Christian at this time, but things seemed to calm down after the men had been captured and flogged. By April, more than 1,000 breadfruit plants had been secured, and the Bounty prepared to sail. This finally happened on the 4th of April, much to the fanfare from the Tahitians, but it was met with complete disdain from the crew, who had gone from a tight-knit group of professionals to now right on the edge of mutiny. The return voyage began straight away with unrest. Christian, disillusioned and harassed, endured further public scoldings from Bligh for even the slightest mistakes. This was especially after a failed provisioning stop at Namuka, where Bligh berated him as a cowardly rascal. Bligh would also rip into Christian over the money that he had been lent, not like Christian could pay it back anyway, and then came the final insult. Bligh accused Christian of stealing coconuts. He punished the entire crew by halving their food and rum rations, and Christian, already despondent, now began plotting his escape. He considered building a raft to flee, but instead, with the encouragement from other sympathetic members of the crew who had also been bullied by Bligh, he began to plan something far bolder. Before dawn on the 28th of April 1789, about 30 nautical miles south of Tafua, Christian made his move. Gathering loyal followers, he stormed the upper deck and took control, and confronted Bligh in his cabin. But the captain was dragged bound onto the quarter-deck. Amid confusion and shouting, Christian declared, "I have been in hell for weeks past. Captain Bligh has brought this on himself." Initially intending to cast Bligh adrift in a small jolly boat, Christian realised too many loyalists wished to leave with their captain. The larger launch was then prepared instead. 19 men, including Bligh, were forced aboard with minimal supplies. Showing some slight mercy, Christian allowed them a compass and some tools, but denied most navigational instruments. Without much further said, Bligh and his supporters were cast off, and the Bounty disappeared into the early morning, with the final sight of the Bounty forcing the men to witness the mutineers throwing the breadfruit plants into the sea. As soon as the ship disappeared, Bligh, to his credit, snapped into action, raising the longboat's sail and setting a course. Bligh's goal was to reach Kupang in Timor, 3,500 nautical miles away. In a little twist of fate, had Bligh sailed further south to Port Jackson, which he was not that far from, he would have run into the First Fleet under Governor Arthur Phillip, which had arrived earlier that year and began to set up a penal colony in what is today modern Sydney, Australia. The men in the boat would, after a short while, attempt to find food on the island of Tafua. This, however, ended in complete disaster when the crew was attacked by natives and one man, John Norton, was killed, and lacking any real weaponry, the decision was made to avoid land for the remainder of the voyage. The open boat voyage was brutal. Battered by storms, stoked to the bone, and sunburnt to a crisp, the crew survived on an ounce of bread and a quarter pint of water per day, stretching their rations to the absolute limit. The little boat sailed through the Fiji Islands and along to the Great Barrier Reef, avoiding tribes, and somehow on the 28th of May, they reached Restoration Island, where they found bushels of berries and shellfish. The men would take their time on Restoration Island, filling their bellies and restocking their supplies before setting off again towards the Dutch East Indies. By the night of the 12th of June, they sighted Timor, and 2 days later the little boat sailed into Kupang. The men aboard were emaciated but alive. The voyage of the small boat that can only be described as a legendary example of navigation on the part of Bligh. It represents the man at his very best. This is before you account for the fact that of the 19 men cast adrift, all but one, the one who died on the island, had survived. Bligh, now safe, wanted to get even, and he raised the alarm with the Admiralty about what had happened, before writing to his wife and sending her a simple message. "Know then, my own dear Betsy, I have lost the Bounty." Christian meanwhile sailed the Bounty to Dubai, hoping to build a new home, and there is no way to say this nicely, he intended to take sex slaves and wives. Hostile natives on the island and rising tensions forced a retreat though, and on the 22nd of September the Bounty returned to Tahiti. There he released 15 men who wished to stay, and tricked local women aboard before sailing away again, taking them as the aforementioned sex slaves. Christian and 8 mutineers, along with 20 Polynesians, 6 men and 14 women, vanished into the Pacific, sailing east where for a long time nobody would ever hear from them again. On Tahiti, the left-behind sailors tried to make new lives. Some of them, like Peter Haywood, settled quietly. Others, like Morrison, built a schooner in hopes of reaching the East Indies. A few, like Thompson and Churchill, died violently, having pushed the Tahitians beyond all limits of hospitality. But for those that had survived, they had opened Pandora's box, and inside of it, they had a date with destiny. It took only a few months for the news of the Bounty being taken to reach Britain, and for a while the news was kind of pushed to the side because in the summer of 1790 war was looming between Great Britain and France. The Royal Navy, acutely aware of the optics that unpunished mutineers projected, gave the orders to the 6th-rate post ship HMS Pandora to sail to the Pacific and to bring justice to the mutineers. Now, remember that the Bounty had a handful of 4-pounders and swivel guns as their armament? Well, the Pandora, she was not messing around. She was armed with 29-pounders, 4 18-pound carronades, and multiple swivel guns. Unlike the Bounty, a small merchant ship retrofitted for service, the Pandora was a fully fledged ship of war. On the 7th of November 1790, the Pandora slipped from the Solar with 134 men aboard, led by Captain Edwards. What Edwards did not know, however, was that the mutiny had already splintered. Fletcher Christian and a handful of mutineers had failed in their attempt to colonise Boy, and with the men disillusioned, 12 of them had returned to Tahiti. This would mean these men, living as beachcombers, some with local wives and children, would be quite easy to gather, but the rest of the men, well, that would be a whole other story, because Christian had vanished into the vast Pacific, unknowingly settling on the remote and uncharted Pitcairn Island. When Pandora reached Tahiti on the 23rd of March 1791, the men remaining on the island knew the jig was up, and they most certainly were destined for the noose. Hoping for some clemency, almost immediately, Joseph Coleman, Peter Haywood and George Stewart came forward to surrender. The rest completely scattered. Search parties were dispatched by Edwards, and one by one the fugitives were found or turned themselves in. Within days, all 14 men known to be on the island had been taken into custody, and a makeshift prison had been built on the quarterdeck, an iron-barred cell just 11 by 18 feet, known by the men, and why I referred to it as, Pandora's box, and the men were thrown inside. With the men in Tahiti captured, on the 8th of May the hunt resumed. For 3 months, Pandora combed the Pacific, searching island after island for traces of the Bounty and her remaining crew. On one of these islands, Tubai, an anchor from the Bounty was recovered. Elsewhere, scattered spars were found, but the ship itself and Fletcher Christian remained a mystery, and they remained hidden. In one of those interesting twists of fate, Pandora actually passed very close to the very island where Christian had sought refuge. The Pitcairn Islands lay off her course, unmarked and unremarkable, but the island's coordinates were charted incorrectly, and Edwards, following old maps, dismissed the possibility. Had he had stopped, the story of the Bounty, and indeed the story of many of the Pitcairn Islanders, may have ended very differently. With the sheer size of the Pacific before them and already 14 men in irons, Edwards made the choice to return home, rather than spend years searching for men that could very easily have simply been lost in a storm. Keeping in mind he had so many men aboard and so many had left the Bounty, it's possible the Bounty undermanned could have just gone down in heavy weather. Then came disaster, because naturally this story cannot have a good ending. As Pandora turned westward, heading for the Torres Strait, she struck the Great Barrier Reef on the 29th of August 1791, and by dawn the next day she was gone. The sea claimed 35 souls, 31 crew, and 4 prisoners from Pandora's box. Some were still shackled when they drowned, dragged down with the ship. It was only through the actions of boatswain's mate James Malta that even some of the prisoners were saved. As the Pandora went down, he forced open the scuttle hatch, allowing 7 to escape the cage. They, along with the surviving crew, made it to a sand cay, little more than a strip of coral and sand in the middle of the ocean. After 2 days without hope of rescue and being so far from the shipping routes that it probably wasn't coming, the men set sail in 4 open boats for Timor, retracing the journey undertaken by Bligh just a few years before. On the 16th of September, the survivors, 2, arrived in Kupang. Of the 134 men who had left England aboard Pandora, only 78 would return. Captain Edwards was amongst the survivors, and he and his officers faced court-martial for the loss of their ship. This was a standard practice. You lose a ship, you face a court-martial. It wasn't anything designed to, particularly insult or punish him. Later, all these officers would be exonerated. The 10 surviving prisoners were also tried for the mutiny on the Bounty. Of them, 4 were acquitted, 3 were found guilty of mutiny, and hung aboard HMS Brunswick in Portsmouth Harbour on the 29th of October, 1792. Others like Peter Haywood and James Morrison received a royal pardon, while one, William Muspratt, escaped conviction on a mere technicality. And with that, the story of the Bounty was over for the British. Justice had been done, but Fletcher Christian was still out there. Back in the Pacific, Christian's hideaway remained untouched for nearly 2 decades. Not until 1808 did a passing American sealer, the Topaz, stumble across the lonely island. There, on Pitcairn, the last remnants of the Bounty were found. Christian, though, was long dead, and his utopia was in ruins, after the women forced into sexual slavery had risen up, killing the mutineers. Only one man, John Adams, stayed alive, through the sheer fact that he had treated the Polynesians as people, joining them and living as one with the now Pitcairn locals. The island today remains a British overseas territory, although sadly I wish I could say the crime there has ended, because today the island is known more for its horrific abuse and crimes than it is its colourful history and the Bounty mutineers. There is more to be read about that if you look online. I'm not going to go into it, but suffice it to say, it's about as dark and depraved as you can imagine. As for Bligh, he would go on to have a relatively successful career in the Royal Navy, somewhat failing upwards on the back of his highly impressive navigation in the Pacific. Bligh would undertake the breadfruit voyage again with success in command of 2 ships before being given command of multiple surveying missions and finally a 56-gun ship of the line under Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen, an action in which he would distinguish himself. Fresh off success from both scientific expeditions and action, Bligh would find himself back in the Pacific a few years later when on the 13th of August 1806 he would be appointed as Governor of the British colony of New South Wales. Bligh was given specific orders to clean up the corrupt rum trade of the New South Wales Corps, because at the time the colony was effectively using alcohol as currency, and the corruption amongst local military officers had run a bit rampant. His actions were undertaken again with little thought and sensitivity, and within 2 years he triggered the Rum Rebellion, another mutiny leading to Bligh being placed under arrest on the 26th of January 1808 by the New South Wales Corps, and again deposed of command. And that is the end of the story of William Bligh, the British captain who'd managed to annoy his command so many times that he was mutinied not once, but twice. These days, he's largely remembered for the colourful mutiny on the Bounty, and the voyage of the Pandora is also slightly mentioned in the history pages. Quite often outside of Australia, though, Bligh's actions leading to the Rum Rebellion and his second mutiny are often forgotten and left to the wayside. But that is his entire story. And if you would like to know more about the voyages of James Cook, or you'd like to learn about the Rum Rebellion in itself and Bligh's full second mutiny in a bit more detail, please do drop a comment and let us know. Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Lesser of Two Evils, this time a bit longer. I hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, let us know if you like these longer videos, and always remember, in the service, and Bligh probably should have taken this on the chin as a bit of advice, that one must always choose the lesser of two evils.